Hello, you're listening to Art History Whispers ASMR. Today I'm going to be reading a little bit of the book Civilizing Rituals Inside Public Art Museums by Carol Duncan. I read this book as a part of my museum studies class and I found it to be quite interesting. I hope you'll enjoy it. I'll be beginning with the introduction. Since their appearance in the late 18th century, art museums have become steadily richer, more numerous, and lately more glamorous as sites of cultural activity. The museum age, as Germaine Bazin called our era, seems still not to have peaked, at least judging from the ever-increasing amounts of square footage that art museums can claim. This book looks at a series of collections from what I believe to be a new perspective, namely as ritual structures. The literature about art museums tends to represent them either as collections of things or as distinctive works of architecture. Museum catalogs, for example, normally treat only the contents of a collection. The collection is not conceptualized as a place, but rather as an accumulation of valuable and unique objects. Books about famous collectors do something similar, usually narrating how and when a collector gained his possessions. There is even a kind of adventure literature in which collectors or curators appear as clever sleuths or dashing heroes who track down and bag their art treasures like hunters or Don Juans. Meanwhile, architectural writers focus on the kind of artistic statement a museum building makes, or more practically, on how its architect handled such problems as lighting or traffic flow. Where the focus is on collecting or a collection, the museum environment itself is often ignored, as if its spaces were neutral or invisible. Most guidebooks sold in museums take this approach, representing the museum as an experience, as almost solely a series of encounters with discrete art objects. In this study, I consider art museums neither as neutral sheltering spaces for objects, nor primarily as products of architectural design. Like the traditional temples and palaces they so often emulate, art museums are complex entities in which both art and architecture are parts of a larger whole. I propose to treat this ensemble like a script or score, or better, a dramatic field. That is, I see the totality of the museum as a stage setting that prompts visitors to enact a performance of some kind, whether or not actual visitors would describe it as such, and whether or not they are prepared to do so. From this perspective, art museums appear as environments structured around specific ritual scenarios, various examples of which different chapters of this book will explore. My intent in this is not to argue a theory of ritual or universal definition of it in the manner of comparative anthropology, nor is my primary interest to establish museum going as something akin to older ritual situations, although there are formal parallels to which I shall point. Rather, I am concerned with the way art museums offer up values and beliefs about social, sexual, and political identity in the form of vivid and direct experience. If, in the chapters that follow, I insist on the existence of museum rituals, it is because I believe that a museum's central meanings, its meanings as a museum, are structured through its ritual. Chapter 1 of this book argues the idea of the art museum as a ritual, drawing on anthropological literature, philosophical notions about the aesthetic experience, and art historical and museological writings about the nature and mission of art museums. Using specific examples, some European, most of them American, the remaining 4 chapters explore some of the most common ritual scenarios that museums construct. These have been chosen either for their importance in museum history or because they exemplify a common type of museum. As much as possible, each example or group of examples is situated within its relevant historical context. Chapter 2 treats the Louvre Museum in Paris and the National Gallery in London, and is concerned mainly with the transformation of the European princely gallery into the public art museum. A transformation that served the ideological needs of emerging bourgeois nation-states by providing them with a new kind of civic ritual. The third chapter discusses the creation of major art museums in the United States in late 19th and early 20th centuries, and looks at how in New York, Chicago, and Boston, the ritual forms of European national galleries were adapted to new political and social circumstances. Chapter 4 examines private collections that have become separate museums or separate museum wings, among them the collection of Wallace, Frick, Lehman, Getty, and the Dulwich Picture Gallery in South London. In these collections, museum goers are most often prompted to enact a visit to an idealized donor who, in the ritual of the museum visit, may achieve a kind of eternal and eternally aristocratic life. The fifth and final chapter takes up museums and museum wings dedicated to modern art. The focus here is on the construction of a gendered ritual space that, ultimately, accords with the consumerist culture outside. The emphasis on gender at this point should not be construed to imply that earlier museums are any less gendered as ritual spaces. It does recognize, however, the atmosphere of urgency and crisis with which modern museums have surrounded the question of sexual identity, an atmosphere that distinguishes them from older types of art museums, which, for the most part, could pursue patriarchal traditions unchallenged. As the above makes clear, I have limited the scope of this book to Western democracies and have slanted it heavily towards Anglo-American examples, the majority being American. Without a doubt, different boundaries could have been drawn, both geographically and conceptually. Were this a history of art museums, the absence of Italy and Germany, both of which set important museological precedents for the rest of Europe and America, would not be admissible. My purpose, however, has not been to write a history of art museums, but rather to explore the ritual content of a select group of them. Even within the limits I have drawn, this study took me into more historical periods and across more disciplinary and national lines than I had originally anticipated. As for crossing national lines, art museums are, if anything, a very international subject. However much they are shaped by particular historical conditions, the politics of their ruling founders, or the collecting habits of their patrons, art museums also belong to the larger international history of bourgeois culture. It is safe to say that all the big national and municipal public art museums in the West were and are meant to be internationally visible. Certainly, their planners always looked across national boundaries for both conceptual models and examples of museum management. Given the historical origins of art museums, this internationalism is not surprising. They appear just as at the moment when notions of the public and public space were first being defined throughout Western Europe, or rather redefined in terms of new bourgeois forms of the state. In the various capitals of Europe and later America ended up with similarly conceived art museums. It was because from the start those nation states and cities had similar ideological needs, and public art museums afforded them similar ideological benefits. This internationalism is still a striking feature of the museum world. today's museums continue to be valued and supported as potent engines of ideology, and the forms they adopt have international currency. Besides its scope, the study is limited in yet another respect. It deals hardly at all with the issue of how Western museums represent other cultures, how their displays of primitive, third world, or non-Western art often misrepresent or even invent foreign cultures for what are ultimately ideological purposes. The issue of what Western museums do to other cultures, including the minority cultures within their own societies, has become especially urgent as post-colonial nations attempt to define and redefine their cultural identities, and as minority cultures in the West seek cultural recognition. However, pressing these issues, the question I am asking here is, although parallel, a different one. What fundamental purposes do Western museums serve in the context of Western societies? My book is, in the immediate sense, concerned not with the representations of foreign or non-Western cultures, but with what art museums say to and about our own culture. Nevertheless, the two questions are ultimately not separate. Western representations of Western culture hold implications for the way non-Western cultures are seen. Let me add one or two more things that distinguish this book from the other studies of art museums. First, it does not argue a concept of what art museums should be. Advocates of art museums almost always argue one of two ideals: the educational museum or the aesthetic museum. In the educational model, works of art are framed as historical or art historical objects, while in the aesthetic model, their unique and transcendent qualities are primary, and the museum space is expected to provide a sanctuary for their contemplation. Usually, but not always, the educational museum is considered by its advocates to be more democratic and popular, while the aesthetic museum is seen, even by its advocates but not always, as more elitist. Both ideals are advanced as socially valuable, and museum professionals almost always use them, alone or in combination, to articulate their goals. What may at first seem relevant to my study is that within this debate, detractors of the aesthetic museum often object to it as pseudo-sacred kind of place filled with a ritual-like atmosphere. In their analysis, ritual means something empty and meaningless, or it implies an elitist content. Effects they maintain that art museums can and should avoid. In my view, the educational museum is no less a ritual space than the aesthetic museum, and, in its way, generates as much ideology. I cannot, therefore, take sides in this debate, since I share neither the terms nor the assumption in which it is usually conducted and on which it proceeds, even though I have often benefited from the insights of writers on both of its sides. Rather than arguing a concept of what art museums should be, my study tries to understand what they are, or, to say it another way, it seeks a critical position outside the established terms of museum culture, articulating what happens in the space between what museums say they do and what they do without saying. It will, I hope, contribute at least indirectly to the debate about museums, if only by insisting that art museums, whatever their stated aims and potentials, must function within existing political and ideological limits. Secondly, this book is not a sociological study of art. How real visitors subjectively engage with art museums is beyond its scope. I have no findings to report about how an average or representative sample of visitors tends or misreads museums. The visitors I am after are hypothetical entities, ideal types implicit in the museum's galleries. There is, however, one sociology of art current that practiced by Pierre Bourdieu with which I share certain concerns, if not methods. In the 1960s, in collaboration with Alain Darbel, Bourdieu interviewed hundreds of people, documenting what others had deduced or observed informally, that art museums give a feeling of cultural ownership, belonging, while they make others feel inferior and excluded. Their conclusions support Secondly, this book is not a sociological study of art. How real visitors subjectively engage with art museums is beyond its scope. I have no findings to report about how an average or representative sample of visitors reads or misreads museums. The visitors I am after are hypothetical entities. That's no good, guys. Jesus Christ. Secondly, this book is not a sociological study of art. How real visitors subjectively engage with art museums is beyond its scope. I have no findings to report about how an average or representative sample of visitors reads or misreads museums. The visitors I am after are hypothetical entities, ideal types implicit in the museum's galleries. There is, however, one sociology of art current that practiced by Pierre Bourdieu with which I share certain concerns, if not methods. In the 1960s, in collaboration with Alain Darbel, Bourdieu interviewed hundreds of people, documenting what others had deduced or observed informally, that art museums give some a feeling of cultural ownership and belonging, while they make others feel inferior and excluded. Their conclusions supported the notion of the art museum as a setting for ritual. However, the performance they identify is understood almost wholly as an exercise in class identity. Despite my admiration for Bourdieu's work, my concept of what happens in art museums does not coincide with his, at least not entirely. Without rejecting his valuable sociological insights, I treat museums not only as socially distinguishing forms, but also as structures with substantive cultural content. A content that is not always or not entirely subject to sociological or political description. That is to say, in what follows, while art museums are understood to be both producers of ideology and products of social and political interests, they are not entirely reducible to these categories. It is, in my view, precisely the complexity of the art museum, its existence as profoundly symbolic cultural object, as well as a social, political, and ideological instrument, that makes the notion of the museum as ritual so attractive. In a similar way, this book makes use of certain terms, especially ritual and artifact, that traditionally have belonged to anthropology. In these interdisciplinary times, such borrowing hardly needs the theoretical justification it might once have required. Even so, I want to say something about it here, because the importing of terms like these into an art historical work is not unproblematic. Chapter 1 will have more to say about my use of the term ritual. For the moment, I shall confine my comments to the term artifact. As a category, artifacts are normally distinguished from works of art, both conceptually and as objects of museum display. The art/artifact distinction marks the divide between the disciplines of anthropology on the one hand and art history and criticism on the other. At the same time, the dichotomy has provided a rationale for putting Western and non-Western societies on a hierarchical scale, with the Western ones, plus a few Far Eastern courtly cultures on top as producers of art, and non-Western ones below as producers of artifacts. This scale is built on the assumption that only works of art are philosophically and spiritually rich enough to merit isolated aesthetic contemplation, while artifacts, as products of presumably less evolved societies, lack such richness. It follows, according to the terms of this logic, that while art belongs in more contemplative space of an art museum, artifacts are best seen in anthropological, ethnographic, or natural history collections, where they may be studied as scientific specimens. Recently, this hierarchical practice has been challenged by elevating the culture of others to the status of art, hence the introduction of primitive art wings into art museums, or the creation of separate art museums specializing in such art. My own effort is related, but rather than choose between terms of the dichotomy, I have collapsed its central distinction. I treasure art, museum art, as a species of ritual artifact, not in order to oppose it to some higher, or for that matter lower, category, but, as I will argue in the next chapter, to understand better the way in which art museums construct and communicate meaning. Like the term artifact, the term ritual has also been treated as a lower term in a hierarchy. And just as this study rejects the art-artifact dichotomy, so it refuses to position rituals as the kind of cultural other familiar in classical anthropological studies. Thus, it is not structured around the traditional anthropological or ethnographic distinction between us, we students of rituals, and them, those who engage in rituals as enlightening or therapeutic practice. After all, I am not an anthropologist exploring rituals in an exotic culture. Rather, I look at some of the most prestigious spaces in my own, and what I assume will be my readers' culture. The us implicit in this study, the learning subjects who look at rituals through a distancing and objectifying intellectual lens, are also the them, the most likely users and students of art and art museums. I have so far emphasized the problems raised by approaching art museums as ritual structures. The main body of this book, however, will not treat museum rituals as isolated objects of study. It will certainly argue the ritual character of art museums, describe them as ritual settings, and analyze them as ritual scenarios. But it will also discuss, often in considerable detail, the social and historical circumstances in which specific museum rituals have been formed. Its larger argument is not simply that art museums are ritual structures, but rather that, as ritual structures, museums are rich and interesting objects of social and political history. As we shall see, the questions of how they should be organized often has been a matter of serious concern in the highest circles of power. Indeed, in the modern world, art museums constitute one of those sites in which politically organized and socially institutionalized power most avidly seeks to realize its desire to appear as beautiful, natural, and legitimate. Museums are, therefore, excellent fields in which to study the intersection of power and the history of cultural forms. To that end, much of what follows will weave back and forth between the ritual structures themselves, how they work, what they look like, and the historical pressures and tensions in and around which they took shape. A final caveat: the museum world is never static. While I have been writing this book, some of my chapter's subjects changed dramatically. Besides the opening of important new wings or new museums, several of the installations I analyzed have been significantly altered or, on occasion, dismantled entirely. The fact is that even permanent installations are eventually changed. Although I have tried to keep up with the changes, I have not always been able to, and did not make me banish it from my text. If it makes a point and demonstrates an idea I want to argue, I kept it. My thesis does not depend on the permanence of any particular museum installation, but rather on its ritual coherence. So that was the introduction to Civilizing Rituals by Carol Duncan. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to read more. I probably will anyway, because I enjoyed reading that just now. Also, let me know any feedback about the recording itself. I try not to be too precious about it. And it's a little noisy in my building. Got creaky floors here, so I hope that's not too annoying. But if you do know a bit about audio or recording, any tips would be very much appreciated. Thank you for listening.